Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's Thomas Jefferson Hour.
And if you are listening February 25th in Norfolk at the Roper Theater, I'm doing my one-man comedy show. I don't like your attitude. I think you think this is going to fail.
I'm just enjoying it with you.
I think you have some
doubts. My
doubts.
response was going to be, are you going to say it 3 times this week too?
Yes, I might be 4 now. February 25th at the Roper Theater. There's a ticket price. It's with WHRO. It's a fundraiser.
Well, let's as long as we're pushing items for you, what about your cultural tours? We just got an email from a woman the other day wanting to know if you were doing another Cuba one. Is that one all filled?
That one's filled, but we'll be doing it again. But here's the one that I'm trying to make people interested in at the moment, the Summer Lewis and Clark in Montana and Idaho tour. We didn't do one last year because we did a special private tour.
You did, but
for
it was
Monticello.
not open to the public.
And this year we're back to our strength. I can't wait. It's in June. Go to the website, jeffersonhour.com/tours. We've already got a bunch of people signed up for it. I am so eager to climb the Wendover you-know-what and to canoe on the Missouri River. It's the highlight of my travel year. And so if you're interested, now's the time to set up.
To get all of this sales stuff out of the way.
25th of February, Norfolk, one-man show, Jefferson without the tights, I think they're calling it.
And you're promising you're going to be funny.
I hate your attitude. I'm
waiting for your jokes. I'm setting you up here, you know.
Okay, so a horse walks into a bar. Wait, listen. A horse walks into a bar. Bartender says, "Why the long face?"
Yeah?
That's not one of my jokes.
As long as we're here, I do want to thank all of you who have chosen to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We really do appreciate your support. And, you know, if you're not in a position to do it monetarily, write us a letter, ask President Jefferson a question. You can do all that at the website, jeffersonhour.com. If you would like to support the show, there's ways to do that there. You might consider joining the 1776 Club for a small monthly tithe.
And you know what happened in 1776. Our man Jefferson launched the most important sentence of the English language. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
And by becoming a 1776 Club member, you will have access to just about every Jefferson Hour that's ever been done. And we have found that there's a real practical use for these shows.
Yes, they put to sleep a
if you have
3-year-old
a 5-year-old that can't sleep, put the show on. Sleep well, Hayden. Anyway, so with all that said, we have a really fun conversation without Jefferson. This week it's you.
About Jefferson. His 13 cardinal virtues, which I find fascinating.
About Franklin.
Yes.
Yes.
Did I say Jefferson?
You did.
Oh, well, he comes up from time to time in the show.
He does.
And Jefferson had to follow Franklin as the minister to France, and he said it was a school of humility.
He was often introduced as Franklin's replacement, to which he replied,
"Nobody can replace Franklin. I only succeed him."
And which was kind of true.
It is true. You know, and I want to say I got a great care package. I'm not hinting to the world here. A really great care package, and the letter was addressed to both of us. It's from one Andrew E. Ramos of Clovis, California, and he's heard about my idea of the Steinbeckian camper truck rig Rocinante.
Right, yeah.
He sent me a kerosene safety lantern.
Wow!
Some lamp oil for it, some matches that won't burn out in a hurricane, a book that he loves called The Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning, about life. It's not as gloomy apparently as it sounds. Some things from the Clovis area, a flyer from an old program I did in Visalia, and more. And then he says, "There's a lot I would like to say in appreciation of your and Mr. Swenson's contributions to the national discussion over what the heck is going on in our country, but I will save to send in the context of reading in the next edition of Becoming Jefferson's People." He also says that if I come in my rig, he will be my personal guide to Death Valley, which he knows very, very, very well. That's Andrew E. Remus. I can't appreciate enough. Send your cards and gifts and your letters. We love them.
You're a sucker for that stuff.
Oh, you know, a care package.
Somebody out there likes me.
I'll tell you, a care package with some honey in it or whatever. It is. Pat Brodowski sends care packages. You've been the beneficiary of those. Yeah. You shouldn't be laughing. You got your sign that says the semi-permanent guest host.
And I was very touched by that.
And so, you know, throw me a bone now and then.
Oh, come.
Yeah. But anyways, I so appreciate that letter.
February 25th.
Fifth, Norfolk, the Roper Theater. I want to fill it because I know this sounds nuts, but I'm going to make an album. And I'm old enough to still use the word album. But it's going to be an album of comic humanist stories. And I promise you, most people will like it better than you.
I think it would be really great if there was some way for me to contact everybody who had purchased a ticket for that show and tell them, be a half an hour late.
No, be an hour early. No, I'm so sorry to hear you talk this way.
I'm just I'm just joking.
I'm shattered.
I would support you in anything you choose to do, pretty much.
I can be funny. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, that's great. Anyway, so let's go to this week's show. And I have to tell you, I really enjoyed it. And I thank you so much for recommending the Brands book. And I'm sure Franklin will come up again on the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
And thanks to Ken Burns for making all this happen.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. In fact, this week we're going to extend last week's conversation about Benjamin Franklin, and I welcome the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good to see you, sir.
And you too. Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790. He lived to be 84 years old, 37 years older than Thomas Jefferson.
A pretty amazing age to live to in that century.
He had surprisingly good health. That sets up the first story. You've heard it before. When Franklin and John Adams had to share the same bed.
Oh, yeah. Yes. We talked last week about the book by H.W. Brands, The First American. He gives a great account of that.
So Admiral Richard Howe invites a delegation from the colonies to come to Staten Island to meet with him because he hoped that in doing so there could be a reconciliation and we wouldn't have to fight this terrible Civil War. And the Continental Congress sent 3 delegates, Edmund Rutledge from South Carolina and Benjamin Franklin from Philadelphia, from Pennsylvania, and John Adams from Massachusetts. So they get to New Brunswick, New Jersey on their way to New York, and they stop at an inn, and there are only 2 rooms, and somehow Rutledge gets one of the rooms, and now Benjamin Franklin and John Adams have to share a room. And so right there, you're already pre-laughing at this story, to think of these 2 men who didn't really know each other very well and didn't particularly like each other.
Laurel and Hardy kind of.
There is a kind of a Mutt and Jeff, Laurel and Hardy, yin and yang, sort of thing here. So,
but it's important. Franklin was very conscious of health.
Yes.
And he discovered many things about human physiology. He was, like we say, a polymath. This was a serious thing, and he'd done some pretty incredible medical experimentation during his life, including he discovered he surmised how people caught cold.
Yes, he had a theory.
It wasn't because you got cold, it was because of confined spaces. And what was the term he used to breathe the other's air?
Right. Yeah. Frowsy air, he said.
Yeah.
Frowsy air. So anyway, they get into this room, and imagine how uncomfortable any one of us would be to have to sleep with essentially a stranger in the same bed at an inn. I can't imagine.
Not to mention Adams being the stranger.
So Adams is fat and Franklin is large. They're both big men, and so there's a tiny little window in this awful little room. Probably the sheets weren't even clean, and they're gonna spend the night in the same bed, which is probably the size of a double bed, not even a queen maybe. And anyway,
if they were lucky.
So Adams says, "I'm going to shut that window because I've got a little cold coming on. I'm an invalid, and I don't want to make it any worse." So Franklin says, "Wait, no, you'll suffocate us." He says, "Haven't you heard my theory of colds?" And so he says, "You must open the window. It's when you get confined air, and it's the effusions from our animalness and our clothing and the bedclothes and the linens. That's what creates the cold. It's not temperature which creates the cold. In fact, the more fresh air, the better." He said, "People who swim don't get colds. People who are sailors don't get colds. This is really a misunderstood phenomenon." And so he says, "Open the window." So Adams thinks, okay. And so he opens the window, and then he says he leapt into bed, which I would like to see, actually. And so then he says, Franklin starts in about his theory of colds. He's going on about perspiration and respiration and frowsy air and so on. Adams said, "I listened as long as I could hold up, and then I fell asleep. But he said, as I was falling asleep, I sensed that he was about to fall asleep too. So here's what's so great about this story, David. We only know it because Adams wrote it. Franklin never mentioned this. It was probably just another night for him. But Adams has a really marvelous, even exquisite sense of humor and self-depreciating humor. And he creates this comic tableau, which is one of the richest tableaus of the Founding Fathers. Imagine Jefferson sharing a bed with John Adams or with anyone, Jefferson the fastidious.
Yeah.
So I love this, that John Adams could tell this story. He often told stories that put him in a kind of comic light.
Yeah.
And I love that about him.
Yeah,
because
so
a person with a sense of humor is a fully civilized person.
There's another story that I really got a kick out of that was sort of a key to Franklin's character, and you probably remember this, and it comes from the Brands book. But ocean voyages were tough enough. On occasion, ships would become becalmed. In other words, no wind, and they were stuck.
Sit there for weeks. Maybe.
Well, on this occasion, Franklin was on his way back to America. I think they were in this situation. It was off the coast of New England somewhere, but it was where cod fishing was happening. So what do sailors do? They have nothing else to do, so they start fishing for cod, and they evidently caught a lot. And they would take the larger ones and stow them for delivery. But the smaller ones, they had do you remember the story? They had a small stove on the deck, and the smaller ones they would clean. Well, at this time, Franklin was a vegetarian.
He wanted to be a vegetarian.
And he was,
to save money and for moral purposes.
Yeah, yes. And he was for a while. But it got to him because he remembered the
smell of that fish.
Yeah, it was so good. I recollected that when the fish were opened, I saw smaller fish taken out of their stomachs. Then I thought, if you eat one another, I don't see why we mayn't eat you.
And then what is he? But the moral is
so convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do.
Right. So in other words, we can rationalize anything.
All we want. Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened.
Story,
it's a great story. And again, this is from the autobiography. America's first great autobiography, still one of the greatest of all American autobiographies, written in 4 different parts at different periods in Franklin's life.
Yeah, you recommended if you wanted to read a biography of Franklin, and you recommended the Brands first.
H.W. Brands, right.
But what about Franklin's autobiography?
Yes, of course. It's essential because he has his own creation myth, his origin story, the famous story that he runs away as an apprentice to his brother, and he goes off to New York, but it was only there very briefly. And then he takes this little sloop from New York to Philadelphia where he's told there will be work. And the sloop takes not 2 hours as he expected, but 30 hours, and there's storms, and they don't have any food.
It's a great story.
Anything to drink. And
you think that might not be true, or it might be embellished?
Well, it's part of the origin story. I think it's I won't say it's embellished, but it's toned up.
Okay.
And so, but think of it. So, like when I get off an international flight or even a cross-country flight, I just want to burn my clothes and sandblast my body.
Right.
Imagine 30 hours in stormy seas in a clammy world, and you're hungry and you're tired and
you're rowing.
You're exhausted. He gets off at the wharf in Philadelphia, and he's hungry, and he has no money.
I love that part.
He has a Dutch dollar and a few coins.
And thinks it'll buy him nothing.
And he goes to a bakery, and he says, "I'd like a biscuit." And they say, "Oh, we don't sell any of that." And he says, "Well, how about a 3-penny loaf?" And they said, "No, that's not how we do it." He said, "Well, what can I get for 3 pennies? Just give me that." And so they hand him 3 giant, think of a sourdough round loaf, 3 what he calls puffy rolls, giant rolls. And they're so large that he has to put one under one arm and one under another arm, and then he's holding the third one and munching it. And he's walking down the street in this really farcical moment where he's made this social gaffe at the bakery, and now he has more bread than he can possibly consume, but he can't throw it away. And just then on the doorstep of a shop is a young 17-year-old woman by the name of Deborah Reed. And he notices her, and she's beautiful. And
he is not.
And she's amused. She sees the farce that's happening in front of her. Well, as everyone knows, he married her 7 years later. That became Deborah, his beloved wife for the rest of his time. She died before Franklin. So this story is a beautiful story.
And gave away the other 2 loaves, by the way.
He did to some poor people. So as if there were people poorer than he, and I'm sure there were. But this is a great story. A biographer like Gordon Wood or H.W. Brands is going to read that, and they're going to ask themselves some questions. Did this actually happen? If it did it happen in quite the way that Franklin has described it? Was he ever as poor and alone in the world as he appears to be? Is he as much a self-made man as he seems to be? Or was there a network of family and friends that helped to lift him up and so on? So a historian has to be kind of a killjoy in a certain way, because you have to look at these, especially people's autobiographies, where we always present ourselves as we want the world to see us. And the biographer or historian has to say, I wonder if there's a way of knowing anything more about this. Is there another account? Did Deborah write a letter at some point in her life? Or was there an independent observer? Can we pick up a pattern of embellishment and exaggeration in the work of Franklin? And on and on and on. Are there internal inconsistencies in the story? Someone might go back and actually find out how loaves were sold and at what size and for what amount of money in this moment in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so the historian's duty is to go in and say, this is the sort of the cultural studies term, David, but to what extent was he self-fashioning? To what extent was he creating a persona, not only in the way he lived his life, but in the autobiographical account that he gives of his beginnings? Because it's in his interest, isn't it, as one of the greatest men in the world, to show that he came from nothing, that the more he makes himself look like somebody who rose by sheer hard work and merit, the greater his story is. And so if he happened to have like a legacy, you wouldn't want to say that necessarily in this story. I'm not saying he did. The story, I think, rings true. But it probably was meant to reinforce this idea of rags to riches.
I as a reader, got just entranced.
Just suck it in, right?
By this his story of starting from nothing and being a candle maker. Couldn't stand doing that. Maybe becoming a polisher of knives. Didn't want to do that.
His father took him around to all the shops and said, "Could you do that? Could you do that? Could you do that?"
And he ended up being a printer, which served him well his entire life.
Well, we'll come back to this after the break, but what was so amazing about it is he didn't just print as most working class guys did. He read the things he was setting into type, and he interviewed the authors, and he borrowed books. And so he was trying to lift himself out of a life of just being a journeyman printer into being a publisher instead, and an intellectual.
Which he did, as we can discuss when we come back. And we will be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation. Well, this week our conversation is about Benjamin Franklin.
And I am not in my tights and wig. I'm out of character.
Or throwing your shoes about. Yes.
Indeed.
We had talked about Franklin as a young man, and during the break, I talked about how entranced with his story I was. It's just like, you want this guy to succeed, and is he going to get a break? And he does. But he kind of makes his own breaks. As you said, he wasn't a journeyman printer. He was learning to edit and recognize good prose when he saw it.
And imitating great authors and reading books. And then he formed this club called the Junto. And it was a group of working class guys, lower middle class guys, in Philadelphia. And they met on Friday nights, either at a rented place or at a tavern. And they would eat, but they would have discussions about things like, is our liberty in any danger? Or what form of government is best?
Didn't they have a great set of rules about what they wanted to do?
So there were 24 rules that you had to follow. And so it's a bit like a service club like Rotary in that sense, although this comes way before Rotary. But there were 24, and there were things like, is there anyone new in town that we should reach out to and help along? Or is there a civic improvement that hasn't been undertaken that we might subscribe funds to and help to lead a subscription? Is there a problem with the way we're governed that we should try to address in this community? There are 24 such things that you were meant to ask every week. Is there a new book that you have that you think others in the club should read? Is there a scientific discovery that you're aware of that would be interesting to try to incorporate into Pennsylvania life? And so this very exacting set of desiderata of things to think about and things to discuss. And this was the Junto, and there were 12 members only. And people came in, and some turned out not to be good members, and others found their way in over time. But this was like a book club and a self-help club and a voluntary association of civic-minded people, and it led to things. It led to a volunteer fire department. It led to
which he was very, very proud of.
It was one of his greatest achievements.
That kind of came from him witnessing the aftermath of the Great Fire in London, right?
And he also created a professionalization of the very informal police force that existed.
I didn't know that.
In Philadelphia, the first circulating library in the New World.
Right.
Then a fire insurance company. Then he looked at the lamps in the city that were lit every night by a lamplighter who got up on a stool and lit these things. And he said the globes, if they were reshaped, not in a globular fashion, but in straight lenses, would shed more light. And he got that change made, and it did. He wanted to get the streets of Philadelphia paved and couldn't convince the city to do it. So he and his friends took up a subscription and paved one street. And then every other street said, hey, we got to have paved streets. And so he started this seed. So think of this. I mean, he's responsible for, not alone, but for these important civic institutions, which we take for, as you know, growing up in North Dakota, at one time every town had a volunteer fire department. Not so much anymore because
some still do.
Some still do. And a circulating library, we take them for granted. But his view was, I have a bunch of books. And you have a bunch of books. What if we all brought books together and then had we each had to pay a fee every year to buy more books, and then you could check them out.
One of your favorite phrases, to ameliorate the condition of mankind. It was like that was their driving force. I mean, what a bunch of good guys.
Instinctive in Franklin, and he spread that around. But other guys whose names are mostly forgotten were part of all of this too.
The one thing that I really was struck with in the Brands book is that I did not realize was how much he loved Britain and his vision of America and Britain and their future together.
He was more British than American, and that's such a contrast because Jefferson was always an American. He said, I wish we could reconcile and so forth.
Well, he was that much younger,
But
too.
he's that much younger. But Jefferson was never a full-on John Bull Englishman. But Adams was, and Franklin was, and Franklin even more than Adams.
Well, Franklin saw it as a profitable venture for both sides of the Atlantic.
Indeed. He was one of the first to advocate the British Empire. And then when he realized that might not quite work, he advocated the British Commonwealth, which is what we have. New Zealand and Australia and Canada are members of the empire in some sense, but they're basically sovereign countries. They all honor the Queen, the monarchy of Great Britain, and he and Jefferson were among the first to propose a Commonwealth model for the United States so that we wouldn't break away into a completely independent country, but we would govern ourselves with a common allegiance to British values, to the British Constitution, to the Magna Carta, and to the monarchy.
Not to mention the economic benefits that both would receive from this.
And much more than Jefferson, Franklin was a man of the empire. He kept thinking this. Remember, he wrote that famous essay on population and said, in Europe, the population grows very slowly and then he pointed out all these reasons. And he said, but in America, where there's empty land, the population doubles every 25 or 30 years, maybe even closer to 20. And he said, the time is going to come, and maybe in only a century, when America has a larger population than Britain.
Right.
And so he said, at that point, we'll be the engine of British greatness. We won't look down on them. We'll always revere them as our parent nation, and we'll still respect and honor the monarchy. But we will no longer, in any meaningful sense, be subordinate because we will be where the action is. And
so what happened is you tell me if I'm wrong, but to make it pretty simplistic, somebody in Britain got really upset with Franklin and watched for an opening and found it with the Hutchinson letters.
He was
But it was partisanship and hatred of a political ally that determined the outcome. And think what could have happened.
Well, if that hadn't happened, he might have sided with Britain, as his son William did. Britain had made his son William the governor of New Jersey, and when the Revolution came, when the War of Independence came, William decided to remain a loyalist. Franklin was so appalled by that.
He went to his house and saw the portraits of the king and queen.
And he never forgave his son, and they never worked it out. They met once or twice. His son had a rough revolution.
Well,
he was
his whole
incarcerated.
Family situation was
It was a
unusual,
strange family, but his son, from Franklin's point of view, betrayed him. The son remained loyal to the British government, and so the son thought, hey, that's what we were, father, because they were in England together. So what happened was that Franklin was publicly humiliated over the Hutchinson letters, and here's why. The British thought, you're either with us or you're not. You can't have divided loyalties, so if you're with us, you don't side with the colonies in this dispute we're having with them. You have to, whatever your private feelings, you have to man up and stay loyal and side with the crown and side with the ministry, and you can't be a double agent. You have to decide, are you going to be with Britain on this thing or are you going to be with the rebels? And he had tried a little bit of – he was sly, Franklin was, and it wasn't clear which way he was going to go. And so when he leaked those letters, the British thought, this is not a reliable member of the British ministry or the British Empire, and they called him into something called the cockpit, which was where the Privy Council dressed down people in intense moments.
It actually was a cockpit for fighting animals. Yeah.
And he was publicly humiliated and browbeaten. But what's so interesting about it is that when you read these accounts, Franklin stood there proudly, kept his head up.
Didn't say a word.
Just took it, just listened stoically. Then he was dismissed. A day later, he was stripped of his office as Deputy Postmaster of America. So then the British really started to punish him.
Well, it was this Alexander Wedderburn?
Wedderburn, yeah, the Solicitor General, the man who browbeat him.
Very ambitious and, again, I guess I'd say it's, I don't know if it's partisan or not, but it was political ambition. It didn't come out well for Britain.
No, it didn't, but of course nobody could have known that at the time. So we have to remember that it's impossible for us to remember how class-conscious Europe was. When I was at Oxford in the 70s, it was still there. And you could go down the street in Oxford and say, working class, middle class, student, professor,
I thought it was
businessman.
very interesting. Recently in the impeachment hearings, it was a Dr. Fiona Hill,
right,
who was English.
And a coal miner's daughter.
Right, and she said at one point in her testimony said that one of the reasons she left Britain, not only educational opportunities, was that because of her accent and the class system that exists in Britain, she would be limited.
Her chances here were much greater. And it's a point that Thomas Friedman makes in one of his books, that we have the ideal software of human merit, that we have a class system, of course, but it's not hereditary. It's not deeply rooted, and merit can out in America more than in any other country in the world.
But of course, to your point, during that time, it was
ironclad. And the term that Dr. Johnson, who, by the way, that Franklin had dinner with, Johnson said subordination, that everyone should know his place and that people should subordinate themselves to their betters, and you should never try to mingle with people above or below your station. You shouldn't fight a duel with people above or below your station, that people should know their place and be happy that this hierarchy
It's no
existed.
surprise that the enlightened mind of Franklin would look at this and just go,
and he was a commoner.
What planet are you living on, right?
He was a self-actualized, rags-to-riches success story from the colonies, and when they needed to, they could put him down over that, and that's part of what they did in that cockpit meeting. When he was in France, the king, Louis XVI, called him in and said, I've been following your career here since you got to France, and I'm very impressed, and I want to thank you for the work that you've been doing. But Marie Antoinette snubbed Franklin.
Really?
She said, why would I want anything to do with this ruffian commoner from what social class does he come from? So she was stuck, Louis a little less so. But even in the 1970s, when I was in Oxford, and apparently for Fiona Hill even later than that, you were immediately aware of a class system that does not exist in this country. And so that's pretty amazing if you think about it.
Franklin loved France. He talks about, I remember reading about how impressed he was with Paris and Versailles, but Paris was better, according to Franklin. It took the palm, I think is how he put it. And among the things he noted were the incredible clean water. They had a cistern system with filtering the water with sand. And, it was those things that impressed Franklin, which again is a sort of a key to who he was.
And Jefferson too, the way, the innovations, the dumbwaiters and the skylights and so on.
And how kind the French were to him.
Yeah, to both of them and to everyone, really. They loved America. There was a kind of a Rousseauian romance with America at the time.
There's a story about him going, I think, to Notre Dame. There's a huge line for something that's going on, and he's afraid he's not going to get in, but then they find out that he's an American traveler and take him right in and show him everything. And somehow in his recollection of this, he says, well, why can't America be this good to its foreign neighbors and travelers? I thought that was really interesting.
It's a fascinating moment. I've got two more for the third segment to set up my essay for today, but let me just say this much more about him for the moment. He was not only a self-actualized person, he was a self-disciplined person. So he, as a young man, this is part 2 of his autobiography, made a list of the 13 cardinal virtues that every successful person should follow. And so he laid them out, and then he defined them in brief compass. And 13 times 4 turns out to be 52. So he made a little grid, very Jeffersonian. And each week he concentrated on one of the virtues. Not that he ignored the others, but he concentrated on one. And then he would work through that entire list in 13 weeks and then start over, hoping that eventually he would master them. I'm just going to give you them quickly. Temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. And he says in the autobiography that he had only made a list of 12, and his friend said, you might want to work on your humility.
I didn't know
there's
that.
some pride in you, sir. And so he added humility, and those 13 then became this rotating list of virtues. And I'll just give you a couple. Temperance. Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Or how about sincerity? Use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly, and if you speak accordingly. Or how about this? Moderation. Avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries as much as you think they deserve. And then finally, humility. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. And so that set of 13 cardinal virtues, temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and yes, even humility.
You kind of set him up as a superhuman, so you might want to finish that story about how long this process lasted.
It broke down. But Washington...
He made it through 13 weeks, though, didn't he?
A couple of times, yeah. But he later published this, much later in his life, and Jefferson had a catechism for these things, and he said that, remember what Jefferson says. He says, in a moment of crisis, I thought, well, what would Randolph do? What would George Wythe do? What would William Small do? What would the people I most admire do in this situation? He said, by following that, you invariably do the right thing.
Do you think Jefferson's Decalogue, his 10 rules, was influenced by this?
I don't think so. I think that's a little bit different. So Jefferson's are more whimsical. Never spend your money till you have it. Well, he didn't live up to that. Never ask another to do what you would not do for yourself. He didn't live up to that.
When angry, count to 10.
When really angry, count to 100.
I have these posted in my back room.
Along with your plaque for the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson House.
And my portrait of Adams from
Chrysler. Yeah.
Chrysler,
well, you get all the gifts, don't you?
Oh, no.
But so he did this. He set up this grid, and he worked very hard with great discipline early in life. But here's what's so amazing. When he was 42 years old, he lived to be 84, he realized he had enough money. And so he retired. Mm-hmm. And he still earned some money from rentals and so on after that, and diplomatic stipends. But he retired, and he said, I'm going to give the second half of my life to science and to civic progress.
And he did.
And he did. And he said many times, wealth is worthless if you don't use it for something good and useful for the world. That wealth per se cannot be the goal
Although
of life.
later in life, when he was older and needed things to be a bit easier, he kind of got used to that opulence of London,
No,
and his apartment and his carriages.
But his point was that he had earned it, that he didn't have to grub for money after he was 42 years old.
I'll give him that.
He had set up a pension system or a retirement plan for himself. And I just was reading, I'm doing this thing on the space program. You'll hear a little bit more about it in today's Jefferson Watch. But I was reading about Elon Musk and the author of this book on the future of privatization of space says that Musk reached a point where he was one of the creators of PayPal, that he had so much money that he would never need to work again, and he decided he was going to give the second half of his life to achieving a greatness that had very little to do with profit. And that's why he is giving himself so wholly to the electric car and to the SpaceX programs that he's working on and so on. But it's very similar to Franklin. He earned a fabulous amount of money early, and now his view is, how much more do you want to earn? Now let's start seeing what you can do with that money for personal self-aggrandizement or for the world.
That's good. Yeah.
It's really cool, isn't it?
It's interesting because he is kind of a reputation like Franklin probably had.
Not everyone likes Elon Musk. And
not everyone liked Franklin either.
Franklin had his enemies. And that's one of the things that I find so fascinating in these books, that when he died, France went into mourning for months, and the eulogies poured in, and they were passionate and deeply in respect to Franklin. And in the United States, he got only a handful of eulogies, and the main one was by someone who didn't even like him. And when the House of Representatives passed a resolution
unanimously
to mourn for him, the Senate rejected it and said, that's not what we do in this country. And so this country has never understood Franklin's greatness as much as France and even England did. That somehow in this country, we have a way of tearing down that kind of person that wasn't so true in Europe.
That's kind of something that's puzzling about America. We need to take a short break from the conversation about Benjamin Franklin. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. This week, out of character, sitting across from my friend, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson.
And
sir.
Proud to be. And we could talk about Franklin week after week after week, and it would never end. There's so much about him, and it's all so fascinating.
I agree, and I want to thank Ken Burns for inviting me to be in his film, and for
really,
you.
Which is what sort of started this.
But then you said, what should I read about Franklin?
Yeah, and I have to thank you for that.
Off we go.
So if we did that, just to get it out of the way, what I'm getting from you is the two recommendations would be H.W. Brand's book, The First American, and Franklin's own
autobiography.
Both of which you can buy electronic copies of for little or nothing.
Well, you can get the autobiography for nothing, for free on an iPad or a
Brand's
Kindle or whatever.
Book at $5 is about the best bargain
That's
you
a
can
bargain.
find.
That's I think his best of many fine books, including an excellent biography of Theodore Roosevelt. But I think he put more into the Franklin than any other, and he was a finalist for the National Book Award, I think.
Pulitzer.
And Pulitzer too.
Yeah.
So I want to tell you.
What other stories do you have?
I've got such a great one. So this is the one that I hope winds up in Ken Burns' film. Franklin was in Paris when ballooning began. This was the time when the hot air balloon had just been invented, and it was very tentative, and there were lots of crashes. It bears a lot of resemblance to our American space program. But Franklin was at one of the first manned missions in Paris, and he was standing in a large group and observing all of this. And the balloon got caught up in some tree limbs, and it had a hard time getting into the air, and finally it began to kind of drift off course, but up it went. And everyone was thrilled, of course. This was as exciting to the people of 1784 as Alan Shepard's flight, his suborbital flight in 1961, or John Glenn a year later in his 3-orbit flight around the planet. And so Franklin was watching this with his usual deep fascination, and a man next to him said, "Yeah, interesting, but what's the use of them?" To which Franklin replied, "What's the use of a newborn baby?"
I love that.
Isn't that something? What's the
that.
use of a newborn baby? I mean, it's a stunning thing for him to say, because you know what Jefferson would have said? He would have written a letter and it would have said, in the beginning of these sorts of technologies, there are often setbacks, and we must honor those who are the pioneers, and even things that fail are important in science because they teach.
I think so much of that comes from his background as a printer. And
You mean Franklin's?
Yes, and an editor who...
Get to the point, nail it, tell a funny story, do a piece of wit. And Jefferson doesn't have that. By Franklin's standards, Jefferson is ponderous. He's not ponderous by any other standard, but he would have written an earnest, thoughtful missive or letter about this, whereas Franklin just said, what's the use of a newborn baby? And nailed it, because of course that's true. That's true of every technology.
Yeah, and we talked briefly with Jefferson, I think, last week about how hard it was for Jefferson to sit through the editing of the Declaration of Independence, but he went to Franklin first and said, what do you think?
Because he trusted Franklin.
It's pretty surprising the amount of changes that Franklin put in.
It's more than we
and how
think.
good they were.
And they're all good.
Yeah.
But, of course, the great one was, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, changed to, we hold these truths to be self-evident. There's just something about Franklin, this kind of genius, this willingness to tell the funny story.
My favorite Franklin story comes up at the end of Brand's book. After 4 months of secrecy, writing the Constitution, he was met at the door by a matron of Philadelphia who demanded to know what these 4 months of secret meetings had produced, and he answered, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it."
When I read the books, I had some doubts about that story. It had a slight feel of being apocryphal, so I went back and looked it up. It turns out it's true. It wasn't necessarily at the door, but it happened soon, maybe at a dinner party, maybe at a salon. A woman did ask Franklin, and it was copied down by James McHenry, who became an important figure in the next generation. So we know this happened. But there's another story, too, as you know, from the end of the Constitutional Convention, and this is back to kind of the raconteur. He said, this whole time I've been kind of looking at that chair up on the dais, and there's a carved sun, and it's half of it's above the horizon and half of it's below the horizon. And said, these months when we've been sitting, I've been watching that chair, and I've been asking myself, what does it signify? And is it a rising sun or is it a setting sun? And he said, now that we're finished, I rather think it's a rising sun. Perfect. Mm-hmm. May not have actually occurred. We think it did. But it's so Franklin, using this metaphor, telling a story. It's not earnest and direct the way Jefferson would be. It's convincing by way of a story. And Franklin was one of the great masters in history of doing this.
Well, these men had a national purpose.
They did. And some of them were able to see beyond their own spectacles, their own bifocals, and Franklin was one of them. So what you're looking for in leaders, and it just breaks your heart to think of then and now, and I don't just mean the current administration. What you want are people that lift the country. John F. Kennedy saying, we can be more. Our destiny is all ahead of us.
I watched we need to go to your essay, but I watched part of the current debates recently, and at the end they all summarize and turn to the person watching with me, and I said, Clay Jenkinson's got it right. If you want to win a nomination, you need to sing
the song of America,
the song of Jefferson.
And it's right. And so the great ones are the ones that say, we can be more, we can be better, we can lift ourselves, we can be extraordinary, we can renew, we can find energies and creativity.
Not a partisan
comment
by me, any party.
The great ones are the ones that did that. And Franklin could see beyond the end of his spectacles, and he wanted what was best for this country. And at the Constitutional Convention, he wanted to suggest that they address slavery. Uh-huh. And he talked about it privately with some of his friends, and they said, no. Yeah. We're just barely going to get this thing anyway. If you bring that up, it'll shatter.
Well, it's commonality with Jefferson, too, I think.
It's knowing the timing.
And what you can get done.
But I just fell in love with Franklin while preparing for this Ken Burns thing, and I'm glad that you find him so admirable.
How could you not?
There's a dark side of Franklin, which we haven't gone into.
Really.
His family relations weren't great, and there were some other things, but
Well,
for the most part, amazing.
He lost his son, Frankie, and never...
Because he didn't give him a vaccine.
Well, he blamed himself for that.
He said, I'll never fail again to be an advocate of vaccination. Are you listening, America?
Well, a parent who loses a child, you always feel responsible.
You second and third guess yourself for the rest of your life,
and
of course.
so did he. But anyway, we do need to go to the essay this week.
Which is about ballooning in our time.
Yeah, great. And national purpose. So with that, I would say sleep well, Hayden.
Thank you, everyone.
It's now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thank you, David. As you probably know, the People's Republic of China has a serious and robust moon landing program. Late this year or early next, China is prepared to land a probe on the moon that will dig up some rock samples and then return them to this planet. China has made it clear that it intends to send men and women to the moon soon, and as JFK said, return them safely to Earth. So let's say that China pulls off a human lunar landing mission sometime in the next few years. It is at least possible that the People's Republic might try to do something even more impressive than our July 1969 achievement. Perhaps they would land a manned mission on the dark side of the moon or at one of the poles. Or perhaps the landing team would spend an extended period, perhaps even weeks, on the lunar surface. All of the American news channels interrupt regular programming to break that news. Here's my question. How would America respond? How would our news media respond? How would the pundisphere respond? How would members of Congress respond? How would our allies and adversaries across the globe respond? How would the administration in power respond? What do you think? What's more likely, that we would freak out, as we did when the Soviets lobbed Sputnik into Earth orbit on October 4th, 1957? Or that we would throw our national will and resources into a Manhattan-style project to get back to the moon and beyond, perhaps all the way to Mars? Or that we would shrug our shoulders as a people, not without some disquiet, but without any panic or emergency response? What do you think? I can tell you what happened in 1957. I'd say we freaked out, but it was infinitely more serious than that. The Cold War was at its height. The United States and the Soviet Union thought they were locked in a contest for national survival. Nikita Khrushchev boasted that the West could not keep up, and he had declared in Moscow on November 18, 1956, "We will bury you." The Soviets taunted that President Eisenhower's grandchildren would grow up in a communist America because it was clear that capitalism was in its death throes. Disgusted with America's lackluster performance in space, former Manhattan Project scientist George R. Price wrote in Life magazine that each of the two superpowers, quote, is apt to get the things it values most, and so we will probably continue to have the world's best TV comedians and baseball players, and in a few years Russia will have the world's best teachers and scientists, unquote. On the day of Sputnik, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson said, "What happened this morning is one of the best publicized and most humiliating failures in our history." A New York congressman said, "I want to see this country mobilized to a wartime basis because we are at war. I want to see schedules cut in half. I want to see what NASA says it's going to do in 10 years cut down to 5. And Senator Lyndon Johnson said, "I do not believe that this generation of Americans is willing to resign itself to going to bed each night by the light of a communist moon." It was not really about space exploration. The Soviet rocket that put Sputnik 2 into orbit on November 3, 1957, was large enough to deliver a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. That made the United States vulnerable to a first strike nearly instantaneously. Soviet nuclear capacity was no longer a matter of speculation. Our ham radio operators could track the beeping of those ICBM-delivered Sputniks as they whizzed over the North American continent. But the crisis wasn't just about nuclear brinksmanship. The United States had been the world leader in science, technology, invention, and innovation for so long that it seemed unthinkable that primitive Russia, barely emerging from Tolstoy's world of serfdom, pogrom, and famine, could have caught up with America. And yet it was true. The Russians put the first satellite in space. The Russians put the first man in space. The Russians put the first woman in space. The Russians performed the first spacewalk outside an orbiting capsule. Meanwhile, America's rockets had a habit of blowing up on the launch pad. If the Soviets really were striding ahead of the United States, that meant that the communist East had caught up with the capitalist West. Maybe a command economy without the need for congressional committees, majority rule, federal court review, without the requirement of competitive bidding and so on, was actually superior to what the free world, with all of its cumbersome checks and balances and its need to win popular approval for major government projects, could achieve, at least in these major engineering ways. The geopolitical thinkers who wrestled with this shocking development also wondered if emerging post-colonial societies in Africa, Asia, and South America would now choose to align themselves with the Soviet system rather than ours, because it seemed to many that the Soviets were winning the race for world supremacy. That was the mindset of the American establishment then, and it soon became the mindset of the American people. But we all know the Cold War is over. We just celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down. The West won. Neither Russia nor China is communist anymore. There is no serious communist threat in the world. The question now is whether the people or the leaders of the United States regard the People's Republic of China as an existential threat. According to economists, China's economy will surpass that of the United States sometime in the next decade, and India may surpass the United States by 2035. China ranks third in the world in overall military strength, and it already has a larger navy than the United States. China is investing heavily in gross infrastructural projects all over the planet, in Africa, South America, the Pacific, even here in the United States. China has many internal problems, but nobody who studies international relations fails to realize that the People's Republic is making a serious run at regional and perhaps world hegemony while we watch the Kardashians and debate concussion protocols in the NFL. Does this matter? It doesn't seem so. At the moment, we don't even have a rocket that can put a human in space. We have to let the Russians loft our astronauts to the International Space Station. I find that humiliating. I find it appalling and unacceptable that we now have to beg rides into orbit from a nation that does what it can to undermine America's democracy and its place in the world. John F. Kennedy believed that the United States must win what he called the long twilight struggle, because it would determine whether we would survive as a free society. He was prepared, as he put it in his first inaugural address to, and I'm quoting, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty." Here's my question, Jefferson Hour listeners. What would you think we should do in the face of a Chinese or a Russian manned moon landing? Maybe it doesn't matter. This is not 1957. Maybe our parents and grandparents overreacted back then in the heart of the Cold War. Maybe a moon landing is no longer the measure of national greatness. Since we have weapons that are infinitely more sophisticated than what could be lifted by a Soviet ICBM, maybe we should stop thinking about those sort of gross infrastructural economies. Perhaps a national panic over a Chinese moon landing would be nothing more than playing old tapes, 8-track tapes created in the age of the Edsel Ford, Elvis, 45 RPM records, and Ozzie and Harriet. That was then, and this is now. Still, I believe these things very strongly. First, China is a much bigger threat to the United States than most American citizens understand. Those who are willing to let the United States slip into second or third class status as a nation have not, I believe, done the hard reading. Second, whatever precipitated it, the American space program was one of the greatest achievements not only in the history of the United States, but in the story of humankind. The Cold War may have launched those rockets, but what they represent is not victory in a geopolitical contest, so much as the pivotal moment when humans left the home planet to explore the universe beyond. Third, national prestige is as important as national power. I feel honored to be a citizen of the nation that put man on the moon in 1969, and I hope to see it happen again during my lifetime. Heck, I hope I live long enough to see us land on Mars. But I don't actually expect that, because we have gone from JFK's "ask not what your country can do for you" to a slovenly, hedonist, materialist, consumerist society with no agreed-upon national aspirational goals. If you doubt me, name one national goal we all agree on in 2019. We can't even agree on polio vaccination. Fourth, I don't speak for you, but I know I will feel a profound sense of shame when China lands its cosmonauts on the moon. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.